Hello, I am here to read a little bit of a portion of this wonderful book that you can probably tell says The Irish World, even though it's backwards. It is just going to take a few minutes and it will be a really good way to set up some framework for some activities that I want to do over the next few days in between St. Patrick's Day and the spring equinox, which is also a Celtic Sabbath that was adopted from the Anglo-Saxon culture called Ostara, which was then influenced in a lot of Easter traditions. So it's a bunch of content that I want to cover over the next few days, and so I think this little blurb pretty much sums up what the whole point is and just gives a little bit of a background info on, the fact that a lot of these traditions and legends and folklore passed down through oral tradition. So, number one, I think it's good to talk about it. And number two, things can be kind of messy and get mixed up and borrowed here and there. And it is what it is. It's just good to acknowledge that and try to trace back the roots, because I just honestly think it's fascinating. So, without further ado, I am going to read this segment from The Irish World, which is a lovely book, very informative, and it is titled Art, Religion, and Institutions. In Ireland, the period from about 200 BC to AD 400, which we call early or pagan Celtic, is frankly prehistoric, though in much of Europe it would be illuminated by historical records. Thus, while classical writers tell us a good deal about the continental Celts and Druidism, we know almost nothing historically about the Celts in Ireland. The popular image of the Druids as venerable robed and bearded figures of wisdom, hung with golden ornaments and parading with sprigs of mistletoe in a circle of stones, is largely the invention of the Romantic period. The accounts we have of Irish Druidism date from medieval times and are deeply colored by ecclesiastical prejudice, although they are based on far older oral traditions. Yet the very fact that the churchmen persisted in the oral transmission of the laws of poetry, genealogy, and mythology is itself due to the perpetuation of the Druidic method. To facilitate memorizing, the material was put into verse, making use of rhythm and alliteration. And the bardic tradition, which thus goes back to pre-literate times, was to survive in Gaelic Ireland not only in the Celtic Church, but in places into the 17th century. The Christian priests also took over the supernatural function of the Druids. Druidism, like so much else that is called Celtic, seems to have absorbed native traditions in Ireland, some possibly of Mesolithic origins. In relation to the European Celtic world, anyhow, the Irish experience was late and marginal. It is an error to suppose, though, by backward projection this is the popular view, that Ireland had some kind of monopoly of Celtic culture in prehistoric times. In early Celtic art, for example, while the Irish material clearly belongs to the family of art known as Latene, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but it is comparatively rare, late and distinctly insular and idiosyncratic. And it was tenaciously conservative, handing on long fossilized stylistic elements, for example, for the Christian scribes to play with. It has been pointed out that Gaelic society here in the far west retained many features which could be paralleled in another peripheral part of the Indo-European world, India. I love this. This is what made me like eyes widen, because I've noticed a lot of parallels between some Celtic legends and folklore and like Hindu legends and their deities. A lot of parallels. So I love that they're bringing all this stuff up. This is like deep. This is good stuff. Yeah, I love this stuff. Thanks for joining me, by the way. So, for example, the custom of fasting unto death as a mean of redress is not quite defunct either in Ireland or in India. More particularly, the Druids, who were charged with the task of transmitting judicial as well as sacred learning, had their counterpart in the highest caste of Hinduism, the Brahmins. Some learned classes in ancient Ireland, such as the poets and satirists, long retained their functions as reformed Druids, but the Druidic rites of divination and astrological computation were apparently abandoned. In other high castes, the equivalent of the Hindu Kshatriya was composed of land-holding warrior kings who had various grades of nobility and free men beneath them. The kings, of whom there were about 150 when we get our first knowledge of them, were closely identified with a particular tuath or tribe, a word which came to be applied to the tiny kingdoms which passed into history more or less directly as the Norman baronies. The king was the embodiment of his people, was held to be descended from an ancestral deity, and derived from sovereignty from inauguration rites performed at the royal places of assembly. In these rites, fertility was emphasized and the well-being of king and tuath was magically linked. These rites survived in attenuated form down to the destruction of the Gaelic order. Succession to the kingship was open to anyone within 4 generations group, the normal property-owning kinship unit, and the succession was therefore almost always disputed. The course of dynastic history, wrote Professor Hayes McCoy, reeks with bloodshed, disorder, and internecine war. True that. Much that was frankly pagan passed into Celtic Christendom and was given a Christian facade, so that it is often difficult to disentangle the two inheritances. This is where it gets good. The lives of the 10,000 Irish saints are related in such extravagant terms, mythology and magic being strangely mingled with piety, that one has the feeling that anything was acceptable if it could pass as history. Most of the saints, in fact, seem to be pagan gods, local deities, or tribal ancestors in disguise. The need to establish a respectable ancestry for kings, and especially for the high kings as they emerged, was a source of much learned but imaginative nonsense. On the other hand, there is often a hard core of truth in some of the orally transmitted lore. The setting of the oldest hero tales of the Ulster cycle is clearly the Ulster border and the state of endemic warfare that existed between the men of Ulster and the men of Ireland. In this warfare, the intertribal cattle raid was a prominent element, a proof of manhood and of the personal courage that was so highly prized in Celtic tradition, as well as a source of booty. As we shall see in the next chapter, so well did the church adjust itself to native ways that the monastic houses were much given to raiding one another, and it is claimed that at least half the burnings and pillages of churches during the Norse period, and indeed back to the 7th century, were the work of the Irish themselves. Shit was just all mixed up. And still is, honestly, but it's okay. And the abbots would unashamedly claim their tithe of the spoils of royal cattle raids. In the epics, emphasis is placed on a single combat, and it was the two-horse, two-wheeled chariot that carried the hero into battle. Handsome, decorated horse bits, often found in pairs, are about the only archaeological evidence for this. Even so, in the archaeological record, as in the historical, it is only the upper classes of society that are represented. Shots fired right there. The aristocratic dress, as described in the tales, consisted of a short tunic over which was a long woolen mantle fastened with a brooch at the neck. The descriptions of the Rath dwellings, however, are so poetic and highly colored that they do not square with the wretched living conditions revealed by excavations. Such evidence as there is for diet, for cooking and eating customs, and for dress accords well with what we know from other sources about the cultural environment of late prehistoric Ireland. We note, for example, the popularity of meat in the diet, especially pork and beef, and the prestige attaching to the possession of a great cauldron from which portions of meat were obtained by dipping, apparently in prescribed order. The most popular ball game was clearly related to hurling or shinty. I'm gonna have to look that one up. A characteristic feature of pagan Celtic society was the itinerant habit of the learned and of the craft castes, and the wandering scholar, as well as a number of traveling men, such as the tinkers, have no doubt come out of this tradition. Dealing men and those who engage in competitive sport and entertainment were also mobile, and they did their business at the various royal places of assembly. Since these activities, like warfare, were essentially intertribal, it was common for the assembly places to be located toward the borders of the little kingdoms, and it has been suggested that this may be one reason for the attraction of the early church to such border areas. The culture of the early Iron Age, for all its martial splendor and its high achievements in art and oral literature, was essentially barbaric and lacked political, administrative, and judicial institutions. It was, in the words of Professor Binchy, tribal, rural, hierarchical, and familial. And the nearest approach to urban forms were the temporary towns or great fairs held at the royal seats. It remained faithful to Rath and Tuath, to hostile to urban life far into the Middle Ages. Its virtues as well as its failings sprang from its tribal pattern. While despising urban life, it accorded high status to priests and poets, to men of learning and skilled craftsmen. Inspired by the new ideas and the Greco-Roman heritage brought by Christianity, the insular Celtic-Irish culture blossomed again in the Celtic Church. And thanks to an inherited tradition of learned itinerancy now extended overseas, it was to have a profound influence in many parts of Europe. So, I know that was a lot to take in, but that really kind of just sums it all up, doesn't it? So, you can't really say that it was a bad thing, that the church and Christianity and figures like St. Patrick absorbed a lot of Celtic paganism and the native tribal traditions and kind of claimed them as their own, because that is what actually ended up circulating them and influencing the culture. So, domino effect, I guess, is what you could call that. Did they know what they were doing? Was that their intention? I don't know. But I think it's really interesting, especially when you get into the oral traditions and basically like creating music and therefore art and creativity being integral part of history and the culture. And I just think that's really cool. But yeah, so we will go into a lot of details that kind of have to go within that framework for the next few days, and so that's why I wanted to share this with you now. It's a little preview, and I hope this was enjoyable. Had to have the phone interrupt me right at the end. Gotta love it. But thank you guys. I look forward to sharing more of this with you, and I will see you soon.